All right, so this week's going to be a little bit different than the previous lectures of the semester. So instead of focusing on a single group or phylum, we're focusing on a physiological process. Instead, we're going to focus on just behavior in general. So this is a topic that's overlooked in many zoology labs, just because it's kind of takes the back burner when people are thinking about, well, zoology. But if you think about it, the behavior of animals is really what most people are studying when they start studying groups, unless they're studying like some sort of muscle or like specific function of something. In general, they're just studying behavior or modifications of it. So this brings the question, just what is behavior? So behavior is any action performed by a individual. So this is usually associated with some sort of environmental stimuli, which we would call a releaser. So if we give the example of a rabbit and it sees a person walking on a lawn, it's going to freeze. And so that rabbit is trying to avoid what it assumes is a predator. So you walking across your lawn would be the environmental stimuli that is causing this rabbit to freeze. And so if this behavior is happening so many times that it doesn't have very much variation in the way it occurs, we consider it fixed or a stereotype or a stereotype behavior. So these behaviors are often become genetically determined. So behavior in general is just a phenotype, so it's the expression of the genetic data or the genotype. And so there's often no need for learning or the transmission of information from one generation or one individual to another for a specific organism to perform that, well, behavior. So that freeze behavior in rabbits, it's going to happen the same way every single time. As soon as it sees something that might be a predator, like you or a fox, it's going to freeze in order to try and stay hidden as long as possible. But if if you or that fox continue to approach it, it's going to run away. And so any deviation from the stereotype behavior could result in that rabbit being eaten by the fox or just pestered by you. So it could have negative consequences for it, reducing its ability to pass on genetic material to the next generation, so its ability to have children, or just its ability to eat enough calories, which would then, again, affect its biological fitness, its ability to have children, or another generation after it from its genetic data. And so those negative experiences from deviating from stereotype behavior is going to stabilize or fix this behavior into a very narrow response. So if you think about how there's some variation in a behavior and only one behavior is being selected for, that behavior is going to become more and more specific over time, removing any other variation. And so that's how behaviors become stereotypes. Basically, through a process of natural selection, they become more and more ingrained in an organism. So we can look at behavior on two very distinct levels. So if we look at it on our first level, which is a very basic level, which is proximal causation, So this is asking what are the environmental stimuli that are eliciting or causing a certain behavior. So in our example of a rabbit and a prey or a predator, that proximal causation or the environmental stimuli that's causing this behavior is the rabbit seeing that that predator. So the presence of a predator in this environment is the environmental stimuli, and so this rabbit seeing that predator is going to cause it to freeze. So proximal causation is the predator being seen by that rabbit. The other way we can look at a certain behavior is to look at what we call the ultimate causation. And so this is how that behavior is going to affect the individual's ability to pass on genes to the next generation. So this is once again kind of referring to biological fitness, just how much, or the, I guess the best way to say it is how this is going to affect natural selection, or how this individual is, how successful this individual will be if it has that certain behavior. So I want you to think of like proximal causes or ultimate causes for our lab on Wednesday or Thursday. So we'll be dealing with mice and specifically with wall-seeking behavior in mice. So and I'll ask this question in lab, but I want you to come up with the environmental stimuli that are causing wall-seeking behavior in mice, as well as how wall-seeking behavior is affecting the biological fitness of these mice. And we'll get much more into that on Wednesday or Thursday when you're in lab and dealing with the mice. But I just want to have those two questions kind of rolling around in the back of your head while you're thinking about this subject and in lab. So there's a couple ways that these behaviors are learned. And so behavior, especially in like complex nervous systems like in mammals or in chordates, well, I guess more specifically invertebrates, organisms will have some sort of prior experience with a releaser or an environmental stimuli, and then they will use that to modify or shape their response or that behavior in the future. So there's two major ways that organisms can learn a behavior. There's many more ways that organisms can learn. These two are not the only ways. It was just two ways that I thought would be neat to go over. So the first is habituation. And so this is when organisms are learning not to respond to a stimulus after repeated experiences. And so you can think of like a scarecrow with, well, crows. So after a while, the crows are going to become more accustomed to seeing the scarecrow. And after some more time, they'll begin to no longer associate that scarecrow as a threat. And so they will continue to pick food or just ruin your garden. So that would be habituation. These scarecrows are learning not to respond, these crows are learning not to respond to that stimulus, which is the scarecrow. The other way that I thought it would be neat to talk about, or the other neat way I thought it would be, well, the other way an organism can learn behaviors that I thought would be neat to talk about is the process of imprinting. And so this is a irreversible learning process where young individuals will narrow their social preferences to the first object that they see when they're, well, during the critical phase, which is when they are still developing And so the young will continue to, those individuals will continue to associate whatever object they first saw as their parent or maternal figure or whatever. And so this is probably, for those of you who have grown up with like chickens or geese, you probably have at some point in time just had a chicken or a goose follow you around for months at a time because it's imprinted upon you. So the first person to really study this behavior or this learning process was a biologist by the name of Conrad Lorenz, who was studying gray-lag geese. And so that picture in the bottom right-hand corner is Conrad Lorenz and one of his flocks of geese. And so he was the first person to really describe this process as well as the implications it has for these individuals as they grow up. So it's fairly important in conservation work, especially with birds, in order to make sure that they are not associating humans as a parent. So in order to prevent like human wildlife encounters, especially with species that might be endangered or rare, where a human encounter might be lethal, the conservation biologists will dress up in these suits and will have these puppets in order to give some general appearance of an adult bird. So the bottom left-hand corner is of a sandhill crane, which was very, very threatened, extremely endangered, and had very low population numbers. And so rehabilitation efforts involved having these biologists dress up in these suits with little hand puppets in order to, hide their own appearance so that these young sandhill cranes won't associate humans as their parent. So I'll talk about sandhill a little bit more in a bit, but the process of learning, especially in close social groups, is what we consider culture. So when this information is passed on, it's generally between either generation to generation or between individuals. So we consider that either vertical or horizontal transmission. So in vertical transmission, you have information being passed from generation to generation. And then in horizontal transmission, you have information passing between cohorts. So a cohort is just a group that's roughly around the same age or maturity level. So an example of vertical transmission would be elephants. So elephants are extremely long-lived animals, and so they experience these periods of drought where they go extended periods of time without water, and so they'll be led to areas with a watering hole by what's called the maternal figure of that I guess it would be a herd. So by that herd, and so that maternal figure is then going to be passing down that knowledge of where these watering holes are to the next several generations of female elephants that are in that herd, so that they can figure out, or they can then lead their own groups when they're grown up to those watering holes. So that's the process of vertical transmission. Just the you have elephants transferring that information of where a watering hole is from maternal figure, so basically like a grandmother or a mother, to a child or a grandchild. So that's vertical transmission, information being passed from generation to generation. Going back to the sandhill cranes, we can give the example of horizontal transmission. So with those sandhill cranes, a lot of them that were being raised in these rehabilitation programs or conservation programs, they're being raised without a set of parents. So they didn't have knowledge of their old migration routes. So in order to help these individuals learn, there was an extremely expensive conservation project in which these pilots were flying these gliders dressed as a sandhill crane in order to get these sandhill cranes to follow that glider along their migration routes. So they were flying from, I believe, like Wisconsin south towards Texas or Florida. And so after a while, after those individuals had flown those migration routes from Wisconsin to Texas or Florida, they would then be able to teach other individuals that same migration route. So from just having a imprinted or an adult, or I'm sorry, a fledgling that had imprinted upon a puppet, and then having that puppet fly in a glider across several states, we were able to basically teach these sandhill cranes their old migration routes that would have been lost otherwise. So that's a good example of horizontal transmission. Basically, you have groups that are of the same age that are then able to teach other individuals of the same age information. So one question that is often asked is how do these behaviors come about? Like, what's the process behind these behaviors? And so, as I mentioned earlier, a behavior is really just a phenotype of some genetic material. So it can be acted upon by the environment, by certain stimuli, in order to become, or change and then get passed on from generation to generation. So you have these environmental stimuli that are acting upon a behavior, but then you can also have individuals or populations changing based off what we call optimal foraging theory. And so this theory, it kind of goes off the same idea of phenotypes being acted upon. And so you have individuals that are going to be the most successful depending on how much calories they can consume over time and how much offspring they can produce. So if you take like dragonflies, for example, they're going to be spending a lot of time searching for food, like this black fly larva or midge that you see here. But at the same time, while they're searching for food, they have to stay fairly vigilant for predators. So you have this trade-off between the energy used searching for food and the energy used searching for predators, as well as the amount of energy gained from finding food. So there's this constant trade-off occurring between basically hunting or being hunted, or making sure you're not being hunted. So organisms that have basically perfected this trade-off are going to have an increased survivorship and then increased reproductive rates. So they can pass on that genetic material that holds that behavior onto the next generation. And so those behaviors will become much more prevalent in the population over time. So you can also think of this trade-off in terms of mammals. So in like prairie dogs, they will be, you'll have this group of prairie dogs, this colony of prairie dogs that are looking for food, and then you'll have one that is staying vigilant for predators. if that one prairie dog is going to go off and find a snack, it's not going to be staying vigilant. It's not going to be looking out for hawks or coyotes. So you'll have a potential predator sneak in, grab a couple individuals, or maybe even that prairie dog that was supposed to be on watch. So over time, you have a pressure or a selective pressure for more vigilance. So you have prairie dogs that will stay on guard and just watch everything, and they'll send out an alarm call. But at the same time, there's also selective behavior against being vigilant. So the more time you spend being vigilant is the less time you're spending eating. So once again, you have to balance these time constraints between eating or staying vigilant. And so those organisms that have basically perfected this process are going to be experiencing increased survivorship, so they're not going to be eaten as much, and then they can produce more offspring. Another way that behaviors can evolve over time is through sexual selection. So in order to back up a little bit, you have to remember that males are producing sperm, which is a very small and fairly energetically inexpensive gamete to produce. And then females are producing eggs, which are fairly large in comparison to sperm, and they're much, much more energetically expensive to make. So this is what we call Bateman's principle. And so females will generally be the choosier of the two sexes because they have much more invested in their gametes than males do. So females will be choosing which males they would like to mate with, and so this causes a lot of competition between males, and then competition, well, by females for males. So we consider those two types, intrasexual or intersexual. So a competition within a sex, such as within or between males, will take place. You'll have like elk or white-tailed deer that are trying to assert dominance over other males by basically trying to push each other using their antlers. There's much less aggressive forms of competition, so you can have these fish. So in this bottom left-hand corner, there's a fish called Nokomis leptocephalus, which is also the blue-head chub. And so they create these mounds that you can see right here that is right behind this fish. So this is a male blue-head chub. You can tell it's a male because it has these spiracles on top of its head. But their way of competing with other males is they will go out and steal rocks from another male's mound and then add to their own mound. So you have lots of males that are basically stealing rocks from each other's mounds within a group in order to have the largest mound, in order to attract the most females. You can also have intrasexual selection. So this is not really competition, but more of females choosing which males to mate with. And so you can get a lot of different behaviors displayed. So this is on the right-hand side, this is Lophrina suburbia, or the greater superb bird of paradise. And so it has this very ornate dance that over time is perfected in order to attract females. So here you have the male going through different steps in the dance. It has this really bright plumage, And over time, that dance has been perfected and it becomes more and more complex over generations. And so here you have a female looking very drab and dreary because she doesn't have to expend the energy to attract a mate. The males do. So this is an example of intersexual selection. Females are choosing based off of the dance that this male is performing. And so you have intrasexual, so competition within or between males, given in this example with Nokomis leptocephalus, or the blue-headed chub. So those two behaviors are one of the many ways that behaviors can change over time. And so usually these behaviors are limited by natural selection. So over time, if you have a dance that becomes too long, or you have these, I don't know, whatever, or say these mounds are growing too large, where they're becoming much more noticeable by predaceous fish, you have the males that are basically performing these longer dances or creating these larger mounds being picked off by predators. So you have these or the two extremes of behaviors being picked off. So it starts to form a stabilizing relationship. So you can't have dances that are too long because you'll be eaten by a predator. And if your dances are too short, you won't be able to mate. So these behaviors have to be perfected over time and over generations. So I mentioned prairie dogs like a colony. And so a colony of prairie dogs is what we would consider a social group. And so living in a social group can have lots of benefits, especially when you're a small prairie dog with lots of potential predators. So some of the benefits of living in a social group include decreased predation. So if you have one individual watching or several individuals watching, you can, or staying on guard, you can prevent a predator from sneaking in and stealing or nabbing one of the individuals of that colony. So you have decreased predation from basically having more eyes on potential predators. You can also have improved foraging abilities. So as a group of prairie dogs are trying to find food, the more eyes that are searching for food, the more ground they can cover, the better chances are that they'll find some sort of food. They also have a increased reproductive potential. So the more individuals within a population, the closer they are, the more opportunities there are for mating. So if you live like a solitary life, so if you're, I don't know, like a bald eagle, well, actually that's a terrible example. If you're like a bobcat and you live a solitary life, you're going to be spending a lot of time during a mating season trying to find a potential mate. And so instead of maybe trying to find food or trying to protect a certain territory, you're going to be spending more time trying to find a mate. And so there's that trade-off between increasing your reproductive ability and eating calories. So in a group, you have many, many more individuals and so many more potential mates. So that's one of the benefits of having a social group. Those three benefits can sometimes be outweighed by some of the costs. So there's not always this selective pressure for organisms being in groups. There's also some selective pressures for being a solitary species or individual. So some of the costs include increased visibility. If you think about like prairie dogs, if you see a single prairie dog, you can probably see 5 or 6 others in that same area. So having fairly large groups, you're much more noticeable to predators. So once you're more noticeable to predators, you're going to be under much more scrutiny by these predators, and so you can, well, be targeted much more. There's also a lot of competition within these groups. So if you think about that colony of prairie dogs, they'll be competing within that colony for food, for mates, for basically everything, for space. So a solitary individual doesn't have to deal with that competition for food by members of its own species, unless it's a fairly densely populated area. You also have to suffer from increased disease or parasite contraction. So this probably applies to some of the world events going on in our own metapopulation, so with humans and COVID-19. But the larger groups that you have, the larger chance there is that one will be infected with a virus or a tapeworm or something that could be potentially deadly, and that can spread throughout that group. So the more interactions you have within a group, the more opportunities there are for that parasite or that disease to spread. And so in solitary organisms, unless you are, once again, in a very densely populated area with lots of other individuals, you really have a fairly low risk of being affected by or infected by a parasite. And if you are infected by a parasite, you have a low risk of transmittance, so you're not going to be passing that parasite directly to a large amount of congenerics, so members of the same species. And so, well, this is a neat photo. So this is several wolves from eastern Idaho. And so even these wolves are following these costs and benefits. So they might not have to deal with, I don't know, decreased predation, because these wolves are one of the apex predators in that ecosystem. But they do have to deal with increased competition. So the wolf pack can only grow so large before it starts dealing with lots of competition for mates, lots of competition for just whatever food items they take down. So they are limited to a certain size, but having a group is beneficial because they can take down larger mammals like elk or what is the other, like mule deer, by hunting in these packs. So there are these costs and benefits. So there's these selective pressures for being a solitary organism, and then there's these selective pressures for being in a group. So I really like to tie in insects because there's examples for everything in insects. And so one of the major things, or the coolest things about insects, especially with much more derived groups like wasps, ants, or bees, is that they can be or have some level of social organization. And so we call this eusociality. So a single female or a group of females will produce non-reproductive individuals that will begin caring for their young. So you'll have males and females. Males will be reproductive, and then you'll have certain groups that are reproductive females, and then you have certain groups of reproductive or non-reproductive females. So this is kind of well known in things like honeybees. You have that the reproductive queen that is laying all the eggs, and then you have reproductive males that will travel from colony to colony in order to pass on their own genetic material. And then you have these sterile females who are all sisters within a colony, and so they'll be acting as the workers, or in cases of ants, they'll have these sterile soldiers. So in the case of like bees, they have, well, their own form of communication so that they can tell other bees the location of flowering plants. And so this level, or this complex level of sociality, is fairly unique. Not very many insects outside of these three groups. So the order Hymenoptera or Diptera, so bees, wasps, ants, or some of the true flies, they won't have that complex level of social organization, and so many of them haven't really developed complex methods of communication. I mean, some groups like some of the mayflies will drum on their own bodies using what's called a hammer, but they won't be directing other individuals to a certain location. They won't be they won't be like recognizing other individuals. Those solitary insects are just calling out for a reproductive purpose of finding a female or finding a male, so finding a mate. But in these social insects, they'll be have fairly advanced levels of communication. They'll recognize each other from pheromones, hormones that they leave behind. They'll communicate through basically through touch, as well as I mentioned earlier, the waggle dance in bees, where they kind of just make these figure eights, which is telling other bees the location of flowering plants in relation to the sun and their colony. So one of the neat things, one of the aspects of sociality in insects that I find extremely interesting is this large-scale conflict that can occur between species and even within species. So you can think of the example of army ants. So these ants in the picture, let me pull up a little laser pointer. These guys, so this is Echiton burchelli, or the common army ant. And so this species is going to be extremely territorial. So it's going to be taking down any other insects that it finds in its territory for food, but it can also start fighting other species that it finds in that in their territory. And so this can actually kind of result in some forms of war. So you have two ant colonies that two ant colonies with distinct territories, and if those two territories start to encroach on one another, they start to fight each other to the death. So these two photos were taken from acacia trees in East Africa in 2015, and so it shows a group of ants called Chromatogaster mimosa fighting between each other. So these scientists just took some zip tied these two acacia trees together, and then were counting the number of ants that were killed in order to determine how deadly these conflicts can become. So this intraspecific conflict is pretty serious. They'll wipe out other colonies once they start to encroach on a territory. And so I forget the name of the YouTube channel, Kurzgesagt. I probably just butchered that name, but they've done a couple neat videos on conflict in ants. And so there's a couple species that have been introduced around the world. So you have the yellow crazy ant, and I forget the other couple that they were mentioning. But these conflicts are not just limited to two acacia trees in Africa. Sometimes these conflicts can become worldwide. So it's a neat topic and a neat aspect of sociality that we really don't think of. All right, so this is what we'll be doing in lab on Wednesday or Thursday. You'll come in and we'll have these arenas set up where we can observe wall-seeking behavior in mice. So a little bit of Princess Bride reference if you guys get it. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, I want you guys to kind of be thinking of the proximal cause or the ultimate cause that might be the reason for wall-seeking behavior. So what environmental stimuli might be the reason for wall-seeking behavior in mice, and what this might or how this might affect the fitness of these individual mice over time. So while you're, I guess, rolling these questions over in the back of your head, just be thinking of wall-seeking behavior in mice, how this behavior might have evolved, and well, how it might change in the future, and how this behavior might be affecting this individual's ability to reproduce in the future. So that I'll see you all on Thursday or Wednesday or Thursday.